Author Michael Pollan is out with a hit new documentary on Netflix on psychedelics at the same time that the House of Representatives is easing restrictions on the therapeutic use of psychedelics. So, are we at a cultural moment where psychedelics might be gaining more acceptance, both not just culturally, but also legally? And to talk about that, we're going to be joined today by Suraj Patel, who is running for Congress in Manhattan and recently worked with Michael Pollan on his new mental health and psychedelics policy that he unveiled recently, and Jon Lubecky, a veteran who was featured in the documentary and also was kind of a leading lobbyist on this push in the House of Representatives, which I think surprised a lot of people that it was able to get through. There were two distinct but complementary amendments, both dealing with psychedelics in the NDAA, National Defense Authorization Act, one by Representative Crenshaw, Republican, the other by Representative Ocasio-Cortez, a Democrat. Both passed the House, face an uphill climb to get through the Senate, get through the conference committee. But Jon and Suraj, welcome to you both. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for having me.
And so, Jon, I want to start with you. Can you talk about this legislation and what it took to get past kind of Defense Department and other opposition to get it through the House?
So, as you said, there were two amendments that made it through. There were actually three that were introduced. And interestingly enough, you had two Republicans introducing psychedelic amendments, Representative Gates and then Representative Crenshaw. Representative Ocasio-Cortez copied Gates's bill and introduced it as her own. Hers made it all the way through. Dan Crenshaw gave a great speech to the Rules Committee and then a fantastic floor speech. But a lot of this has been not just myself, but other organizations like MAPS and VETS, Veterans Exploring Treatment Solutions, who, contacted offices, had Navy SEALs and others who've been impacted by this, reach out and just tell their stories. The science is there. A lot of this is education, and there's been a lot of education over the past few years. You've seen that as legislation and report language has moved through, culminating in getting these two amendments all the way through the House, and hopefully we can get an amendment introduced in the Senate.
Well, and Suraj, it's not just Michael Pollan. Gwyneth Paltrow did an episode of her Goop Netflix series on psychedelics as well. But I think to Jonathan's point, you three know this issue so well, but Republicans sort of coming around speaks to how powerful the science is. And it's very powerful when you talk about veterans getting treated for PTSD, but it's so broad. I mean, this is something that could benefit so many people. And so I was wondering if you could speak, Suraj, to basically what we have learned about how effective these treatments can truly be.
Yeah, I mean, let's just start with the facts here that over 50% of Americans at some point in their lives are going to suffer from mental illness, according to the CDC, and that number increases every single year. With the highest suicide rate in the world, that number increases almost every single year. And so we have a mental health epidemic in America. And one of the most promising arrows in our quiver, the use of psychedelic-assisted therapy with psilocybin or ketamine or MDMA have been outlawed as a research thing for decades, thanks to a Nixonian obsession with drugs and counterculture. Nobody believes that shutting down research on something that was so promising in the 50s and 60s should still make sense. And this is a generational problem, guys. That what you're seeing isn't that it's Republicans and Democrats. What you're seeing is that some of the younger Republicans and younger Democrats in office who understand that we need to shed that Nixonian obsession and move forward toward science. And so let me just say that, we know that, for example, ketamine is now approved for treatment-resistant depression. Unlike SSRIs, which the United States is the highest consumer of them, which is a chronic thing. You have to take Prozac your whole life. Ketamine is effective within 4 hours, not 2 to 4 weeks. Its benefits last for months at a time. It has anti-addictive properties. It helps to quit smoking, alcoholism, and things like that. So there's nothing about this that's dangerous. In fact, we use ketamine to anesthetize children because it's the safest anesthetic because it doesn't make your heart rate go down. At the same time, with NIH funding, which is the only ballgame in town, until the FDA and the DEA deschedule or reschedule psilocybin down, We've only seen about $30 million of NIH funding fund into probably one of the highest potential things we have to cure or take a major stab at mental illness in America. And so we need to expand the use of these things. We need to expand the research opportunities for this and expand compassionate use to allow psychedelics for mental health disorders. I'll add one more thing. There's an initiative called the Brain Initiative. It is a moonshot. Currently, if we double the funding for it, it is like the Human Genome Project. The project is to map the brain and how it works, to attack psychological disorders like schizophrenia, bipolar disorder. If any of you have ever lost a parent to Alzheimer's or dementia, it's an incredibly painful thing to watch. And we as a country need to lead with science and compassion when it comes to these things and shed this generational obsession with the past. Just because it's been done doesn't mean it's right.
And Jon, I think a decent number of people watching this segment now would be saying, "Well, I understand everything you're saying. This makes sense to me." The other half might be like, "This sounds impossible. How could something actually be this effective and be kept away from people?" So, as somebody who has gone through the therapy yourself, can you talk about, you try to explain to people why it is that these therapeutic assisted kind of shorter sessions are able to have such compelling results for people?
So one of the things to realize is these medicines, they're not really the thing that's fixing you. It puts the mind, body, and spirit in the place it needs to be for therapy to work. So, for example, when it comes to PTSD, there's a lot of barriers to even getting remotely close to the trauma to talk about it and process it. The medication puts the mind, body, and spirit in the place it needs to be. As Suraj was talking about, one of the things psilocybin's actually very good for is end-of-life care in cancer patients so that they can, pass with dignity rather than anxiety. And the Crenshaw Amendment actually goes so far as to not just include MDMA and psilocybin, but also ibogaine and 5-MeO-DMT. Ibogaine shows so much promise. We need a ton of funding to be able to research it. 600 Navy SEAL,
right?
Addiction, brain injuries, PTSD. 600 operators have gone down to Mexico. They've had to leave the country they fought and bled for to get treatment so they didn't die. And I will also throw out, it's the same clinic that Hunter Biden went to. He's actually doing very well since he did the ibogaine. And as Representative Crenshaw said, veterans, everyone deserves to have this research, to have these answers. And then for me, let the chips fall where they may. If it's shown that MDMA assisted therapy is counterindicative for something, I'm okay with it. I know people who, for example, because MDMA is a stimulant, if there's certain heart conditions and things with blood pressure that become problematic, it's counterindicated. I'm okay with that. I lead with the science, let the chips fall where they may, but we need to do the research. And this is where having DOD fund this and allowing active duty troops to participate with this cornucopia of substances should lead to hopefully a mass influx of cash, because it's not just NIH. The VA funds a lot and the DOD funds even more. They spent, I believe it's $37 million with the University of North Carolina to have them create a psychedelic that isn't psychedelic. So it's not that they don't know this works. They're already funding other things. And ibogaine phase 1 trial probably costs $1.52 million, which is budget dust in DOD terms. But right. You can keep, and you're looking at DOD with 60% loss in recruiting.
Yeah.
Yeah, let's just add one more thing I want to say, which is that why are we talking about this right now when these are compounds that are clearly working? No one's asking for tax dollars. No one's asking for a massive new spending program. All we're asking is for the programs that are already in place that the NIH and the DOD and the VA fund right now for mental health research that are forced to use the things we have right now, which are all temporary SSRIs and things like that. All we're saying is that there are compounds that were so promising in the 1950s and 60s, And Richard Nixon, who was so paranoid, obsessive compulsive, and pro-Vietnam War, was just angry, frankly, and had a tantrum at the counterculture and at hippies and anti-war protesters, and decided to punish them by outlawing some of the substances they were using recreationally. That is all we're talking about here. And you've got, I'm running against two incumbents who have been in office since 1992. And one of the things I always talk about is how we have dynamic new policies, and people ask you how. And I'm saying because 2 or 3 generations of policymaking have happened at the academic level, at the think tank level, and yet the people in office are the ones that were still taught economics by Milton Friedman, for example. And that's what I'm talking about when we talk about needing fresh ideas and new energy in Congress, is about bringing people into office who aren't slaves to this past, this broken war on drugs past, this broken economic model past. And our climate can't wait, but our mental health really, truly cannot wait. So we need people in office who understand these things and who want to push forward on the frontiers of making people's lives better.
Nixon,
and also,
maybe could have used some ketamine.
Could have really used
Hey, let's not pretend it was just Nixon. The current president, Joe Biden, has had a one-man war against MDMA, so much so that he rose on the floor of the Senate to speak about how awful it was, and then 6 days later voted to send me to Iraq.
That's right.
So the drug war has absolutely been a bipartisan thing. I think ending it requires bipartisanship. One of my biggest fears is that psychedelic science and the promise that this holds gets drug into the culture war. And this is where, I love Representative Ocasio-Cortez, but her supporting a psychedelics amendment is a very AOC thing to do. Having Dan Crenshaw stand on the House floor and talk about it is going to win over a lot of people who wouldn't have otherwise considered it.
Maxine Waters, Congresswoman Waters, formerly of Orange County, has been leading a major push for this, a Republican, mind you, leading a major push for this. And I actually met with her on the Upper East Side here in New York. Sorry? Mimi Waters, sorry.
Mimi.
Mimi Waters, yeah. And I met with her on there are so many of them. And I met with her on the Upper East Side to talk about this a few months ago at an event with the Apollo Pact, because this needs to remain this needs to be and remain a bipartisan thing. It needs to be about people's mental health. It's not about recreation. This is about the science. It is about putting a lock and key on the human mind. The United States of America cannot fall behind and become a less dynamic society because the people in office refuse to change. And that's why we need new people in office.
And one point on Hunter Biden, to pick up on what Jon had said, we've played that clip probably a couple times now where he says, I've made the decision in my life that I'm going to, use the influence that I have with my father, and the right has made a huge deal about that because he obviously has, made a lot of money, on his last name. But specifically in that conversation, what he was talking about was getting his father to prioritize addiction. So Hunter, if this has worked for him, he really does need to step up, because, like you said, Jon, Biden, among his 30-year drug war career, he also pushed the RAVE Act, one of the most draconian federal laws, which basically criminalized going to an event, even whether or not you were committing any particular crime there, just being there, which is just wildly unconstitutional. I think if Suraj manages to win while talking about this, I think that could shake things up in Congress a little bit and get people who've been there.
We absolutely plan to win, and we absolutely plan to talk about this. My district, for example, in Manhattan is, leads in the country in terms of anxiety, in terms of depression, for a variety of reasons, and the pressures and stresses we face here in New York, especially after coronavirus. And there's absolutely nothing wrong and nothing to shy away from here. My opponent voted for the 94 crime bill and every single probably bad bill in the Democratic caucus for the last 30 years, including the creation of ICE and things like that. So I think the contrast is stark there. And you can see it, frankly. So yeah, we have an election on August 23rd, and it is one in which psychedelic-assisted therapy is on the ballot. It is on the ballot in the form of Suraj Patel versus two incumbents who have been in office since 1992.
Well, thank you both so much for your time and your insights on this important issue. We really appreciate it.
Thanks.
Thank you.
We'll be back with more Rising right after this.